Media reports in early February 2026 indicated that Japan is considering joining a NATO-led initiative designed to purchase US-made weapons and military equipment for Ukraine. The reports, initially circulated by Japanese broadcaster NHK and subsequently picked up by international outlets, suggested that Tokyo is exploring participation in a framework known as the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL. This mechanism, established by the United States in coordination with NATO allies, is intended to streamline the funding and procurement of critical defense equipment for Ukraine as it continues to confront Russia's full-scale invasion. According to the reports, Japan's potential involvement would center on financial contributions toward the purchase of US-manufactured equipment destined for Ukraine. However, sources cited in the media emphasized that Japan's participation would likely be limited to non-lethal items, such as radar systems, protective gear, communications equipment, and other defensive or support-oriented technologies. This distinction is significant given Japan's constitutional and legal constraints on the export of lethal weapons to countries engaged in active conflicts. The PURL initiative itself was reportedly created to address logistical and political challenges associated with supplying Ukraine's military. Rather than each country independently negotiating purchases and transfers, the framework aggregates funding commitments from participating states and channels them toward prioritized items identified by Ukrainian authorities in coordination with NATO planners. By centralizing procurement, the initiative aims to reduce delays, enhance transparency, and ensure that equipment reaching Ukraine aligns closely with battlefield requirements. Under the program, participating countries commit financial resources, and the United States oversees procurement from its defense industry before delivery to Ukrainian forces through coordinated channels. Several NATO member states have already joined the initiative, committing billions of dollars collectively. Non-NATO partners have also expressed interest or participation, underscoring the global dimension of support for Ukraine. If Japan formally joins, it would represent one of the most prominent non-European contributors to a NATO-led procurement mechanism. Although Japan is not a NATO member, it has developed increasingly close ties with the alliance over the past decade, including participation in high-level dialogues, joint exercises, and strategic consultations. The reported plan for Japan to limit its contribution to non-lethal equipment reflects long-standing features of its post-war defense policy. Japan's constitution, particularly Article 9, renounces war as a sovereign right and restricts the maintenance of armed forces for offensive purposes. Although Japan maintains the self-defense forces and has gradually expanded their operational scope, arms export policy has historically been tightly controlled. The 3 principles on arms exports, established in the 1960s and modified over time, have generally prohibited the transfer of weapons to countries engaged in conflict. In recent years, Tokyo has revised and reinterpreted aspects of its defense export framework, allowing for greater cooperation with allies and limited transfers under strict conditions. Nonetheless, direct lethal military assistance to a country at war remains politically and legally sensitive. Japan has already provided substantial support to Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. That support has included humanitarian assistance, financial aid, sanctions against Russia, and non-lethal military equipment. Tokyo has contributed billions of dollars in loans and grants aimed at stabilizing Ukraine's economy, rebuilding infrastructure, and supporting displaced civilians. Japan has also supplied items such as helmets, bulletproof vests, and other protective gear. In addition, Tokyo has coordinated closely with G7 partners to maintain economic pressure on Moscow, including through export controls and asset freezes. Beyond direct assistance, Japan has facilitated indirect support for Ukraine through cooperation with the United States. For example, adjustments to Japan's defense export rules have allowed the transfer of certain US licensed defense components, thereby enabling Washington to manage its own stockpiles more flexibly. These steps have been framed by Japanese leaders as consistent with Japan's commitment to international peace and stability, while remaining within the bounds of domestic law. The significance of Japan potentially joining the Pearl Initiative extends beyond the immediate material impact of its financial contribution. Strategically, such a move would signal deeper integration between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security networks. Over the past several years, Japan has emphasized that security in Europe and Asia is increasingly interconnected. Japanese officials have argued that unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force, whether in Eastern Europe or the Indo-Pacific, pose systemic risks to the international order. By supporting Ukraine through a NATO-linked mechanism, Tokyo would be reinforcing the principle that aggression in one region has global implications. The move would also underscore the strength of the US-Japan alliance. The United States remains Japan's primary security guarantor, and coordination with Washington on major geopolitical issues is a central pillar of Japanese foreign policy. Participating in a US-led procurement framework aligns with Japan's broader strategy of reinforcing alliances and partnerships to deter potential adversaries. In recent years, Japan has expanded defense cooperation not only with the United States, but also with Australia, the United Kingdom, and European partners. Its engagement with NATO has included opening liaison channels and participating in discussions on cybersecurity, maritime security, and emerging technologies. Russia's likely reaction to Japan's reported plans is a key consideration. Moscow has consistently criticized Western military assistance to Ukraine, portraying it as escalation and interference. Although Japan's reported contribution would focus on non-lethal equipment, Russia could interpret any additional support as further alignment with NATO against Russian interests. Relations between Tokyo and Moscow have deteriorated sharply since 2022. Including the suspension of peace treaty negotiations over the long-disputed Northern Territories, known in Russia as the Southern Kurils. Additional Japanese involvement in Ukraine-related defense initiatives could further strain bilateral ties. China's perspective is also relevant. Beijing has frequently expressed opposition to what it describes as the expansion of NATO's influence beyond its traditional geographic boundaries. Japan's participation in a NATO-coordinated framework could be viewed by China as another example of cross-regional alignment among US allies. At the same time, Japan has framed its international engagement as defensive and principles-based, rather than bloc-oriented. Japanese policymakers have emphasized that support for Ukraine is rooted in respect for sovereignty and international law, values that Tokyo argues are universally applicable. Domestically, the issue touches on ongoing debates within Japan about the country's security posture. Public opinion in Japan has evolved in recent years, with growing awareness of regional security threats, including North Korean missile tests and increased Chinese military activity around Taiwan and in the East China Sea. These developments have prompted the Japanese government to adopt a new national security strategy, increase defense spending, and consider counter-strike capabilities. Even so, significant segments of the public remain cautious about overseas military entanglements. Limiting support for Ukraine to non-lethal equipment may be seen as a compromise that balances international responsibility with constitutional pacifism. Media reports have not been entirely consistent, and some accounts have suggested that the Japanese government has been cautious in confirming the details. In certain instances, officials have reportedly downplayed or clarified aspects of the reporting, indicating that discussions are ongoing rather than finalized. This ambiguity may reflect the sensitivity of the issue domestically and diplomatically. Governments often conduct extensive consultations before announcing participation in high-profile international initiatives, particularly those involving defense procurement. If Japan does formally join the PRL initiative, several practical questions will follow. These include the scale of its financial commitment, the specific categories of equipment it will fund, and the timeline for implementation. The size of Japan's contribution could influence perceptions of burden sharing among US allies. As the world's third-largest economy, Japan has the capacity to make a meaningful financial impact, though budgetary considerations and domestic priorities will also shape its decision. Another important dimension is how Japan's involvement might affect other non-NATO partners. Countries such as Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand have also provided varying degrees of support to Ukraine. Japan's participation could encourage broader engagement from Indo-Pacific partners, reinforcing the idea that assistance to Ukraine is not solely a European or North American responsibility. Such cross-regional cooperation may become an enduring feature of global security policy, particularly as alliances adapt to transnational challenges. The broader strategic context is one in which traditional geographic boundaries of security institutions are becoming less rigid. NATO has increasingly engaged with partners in the Indo-Pacific, while Asian allies have taken a more active interest in developments in Europe. The war in Ukraine has accelerated this convergence by highlighting the global consequences of major power conflict. Supply chains, energy markets, food security, and defense industrial capacity are all interconnected across regions. In this environment, Japan's potential decision to join a NATO-led procurement initiative reflects an understanding that stability in Europe has implications for stability in Asia. At the same time, Japan's approach appears calibrated. By focusing on non-lethal equipment and financial contributions rather than direct weapons transfers, Tokyo can demonstrate solidarity without fundamentally overturning its long-standing defense principles. This incrementalism has characterized much of Japan's security evolution over the past 2 decades. Rather than abrupt transformation, policy has shifted gradually through reinterpretation, legislative updates, and carefully framed initiatives. For Ukraine, additional funding for US-made equipment, whether lethal or non-lethal, can help sustain its defense capabilities. Modern warfare relies not only on missiles and artillery, but also on radar, communications, protective equipment, logistics systems, and maintenance support. Non-lethal contributions can therefore have significant operational impact. By participating in a coordinated framework, Japan would also help ensure that its assistance is integrated with broader Allied planning. Ultimately, the reported move highlights the continued internationalization of the Ukraine conflict. What began as a regional war has drawn in financial, political, and military support from countries across multiple continents. Japan's potential role in a NATO-led initiative symbolizes this global dimension. It also reflects Japan's own transformation from a primarily region-focused security actor into a more globally engaged stakeholder in the rules-based international order. Whether and when Tokyo formally confirms its participation remains to be seen. Official announcements, parliamentary discussions, and diplomatic consultations may shape the final contours of its involvement. Regardless of the precise details, the mere consideration of joining such an initiative underscores how profoundly the war in Ukraine has reshaped international alignments and prompted countries far from the battlefield to reassess their roles. In this sense, Japan's reported plan is not an isolated development, but part of a broader pattern. As alliances evolve and global security challenges multiply, countries are increasingly linking regional theatres into a shared strategic framework. Japan's possible entry into a NATO-coordinated procurement effort for Ukraine exemplifies that trend. A careful, legally bounded but symbolically powerful step toward deeper cross-regional security cooperation in response to one of the most consequential conflicts of the 21st century.